'cause you're clinging on. Little thread, sing out your song. Digging, 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 digging.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our evening about climate resilience and strategies for our current times. My name is Charles Williams. Hello. I know many of you. Good to see you again. Before we get started, just want to say welcome. I'm calling to you all from Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Some people know it as Nova Scotia, Canada. And it's been a lovely fall here in Mi'kma'ki. The colors are changing, and it's been kind of a mix of really warm weather kind of transitioning into the fall. It's been nice. I also just want to acknowledge we're in a point in time where the last few days have been stressful for many folks, especially folks in the States. And I want to start tonight off just with, let's take a moment and settle in and ground. So just invite everybody just to get comfortable in your chair, take a deep breath. And relax. Let yourself arrive here. Let distractions go for the moment. You can always pick them up again later. Just allow yourself to be here. Feel the tug of the earth. Feel the gravity pulling on you, holding you here. See if you can become aware of the earth below you. Somewhere down there, there's soil and life. Just let your awareness sink down to where it touches and settles into the earth. And allow yourself to be here now. I invite you to notice what you hear around you. Maybe you're somewhere fairly quiet or somewhere bustly. Just notice where you're at and what it sounds like. Notice what it smells like. Are there any smells? Maybe a meal that's cooking, a warm beverage somewhere. Notice how you're feeling right here, right now. And notice what you're feeling, how your seat feels as you sit in it, how your clothes hang, maybe the temperature on your skin. Just notice what you feel and how you feel. And when you're ready, open your eyes. For those who have their eyes closed, and for other folks, if your eyes are open, look around and notice what you see. Just look around. You're probably somewhere familiar, maybe not, maybe yes. Notice anything that is new that you haven't noticed in a while. A little detail. Often we get used to our places. There's little things we can re-notice. So in all of our senses, I say welcome. Welcome here to this evening. It's great to have you all. And for those who are watching in the recording later, welcome to you too. So tonight, we have a couple of amazing permaculturalists and disaster-oriented or solution-oriented folks. We have Chris Gilmour and we got Delyla Wilson, who will be talking with us tonight. And how I've conceived of tonight is to be like a question and answer, like a conversation. sometimes we have our pop-ups, our slideshows and presentations and information. And this one I wanted to be a little more casual, a little more directed by what's coming up for everybody in the room. So how this is going to work, I've got some questions that people sent in early on. Also, Zoom has a little bar at the bottom, usually if you're on a computer or somewhere on your screen, where you can like type in a question. There's like a Q&A section. You can put a question in there. That's easy for us to track. You can put it in the chat. If none of that works for you, you can turn your camera on and like, raise your hand or use the little raise hand icon and we'll call on you. And if none of those things work, you can unmute and just be like, hey, technology is not super friendly to me, and I'm just going to say my question out. So lots of ways to get your questions out, and we'll do our best to answer them, talk about some, if there's simple answers or complex answers or how we might approach things. So that's what we're going with tonight. This is also a promotion for some of our classes, because this is just going to be a moment, but we have some classes coming up, a permaculture design course where we talk about kind of ecological design and what we can do in our daily lives. We also have a emergency preparedness and disaster response course that Chris is teaching. I'll put the links to these in the chat. And if you're interested in this stuff and want to know more, those are a good place to go. So I'm going to just move on from there. I'm going to have Chris and Delyla introduce themselves. And once we've done the introductions, we'll start with some questions. So maybe Chris, if you want to lead off.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks, Charles. And thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us this evening for, I think, a very important conversation and a timely one. And, sometimes these types of conversations can bring up a little bit of anxiety or even be the kinds of things that people just don't even want to think about. And I'm actually super grateful for people that are willing to look at them, because that actually, to me, is alleviating the anxiety, to actually face some of the challenges of our world head on and to do it from a proactive and even an optimistic place, but also a realistic place too, and I think tonight will hopefully be a healthy blend of both. So maybe just a couple really quick things about my background. I don't want to talk too long here. But I'm coming to you from up on a giant ancient land formation we call the Granite Shield up in what's known as Ontario, Canada today. And it's an area with a very rich history, both ecologically and human. Is there an ology word I can put to human? Ecologically and as far as the humans of this land, and that the many different nations that have lived here over the time, from the Anishinaabe peoples to the Haudenosaunee peoples and the Huron-Wendat and the Piton and the Neutrals. It's got a very rich history and a very ecologically diverse place. My story in a nutshell and how I'm kind of maybe involved with the conversation tonight is I, about 20 years ago, became fascinated with growing food and permaculture. That's when I first started reading some of Starr's books and started doing permaculture apprenticeships, and had a moment on a farm one year where I realized, I'm calling what I'm doing sustainable agriculture, but I know so little about the forest and the ecology around the farm. How do I actually know it's sustainable? And that sent me on this lifelong journey of really learning about ecology and ecological relationships and really wanting to learn the land. That led me down the path of studying wilderness survival and ancient living ways and learning from many different First Nations communities and survival instructors around the world, knowing that living off the land in a subsistence kind of way is actually one of the original teachers of deep ecology, and understanding those relationships. And then that took me to a place of, going from wilderness survival and thinking about the modern context and application of all these things. Went deep down the rabbit hole of emergency preparedness, actually went back to school, studied courses, got some certifications, started working for a consulting company in kind of modern emergency management, like working with like governments and hospitals and hydro corporations and things like that. But it wasn't quite where I felt like my vision was meant to work in the world. And I really wanted to kind of bridge all those things together. So bridging kind of like permaculture and deep connection with the earth with deep awareness and connection to the land, with kind of the best of modern day preparedness, with community skills as well, and social justice and activism and some of the stuff that Earth Activist does. And I guess the last thing I'll say is my wife and I have a little 26-acre permaculture homestead up here. And we're also foragers. So we forage quite a bit of food. We grow quite a bit of food. We practice forest gardening while teaching preparedness and nature connection stuff. So there's me in a nutshell.
All right. Well, hi, I'm Delyla. Um, I came, so I'm very happy to be here. I love talking about disaster resilience and disaster preparedness. Um, my entrance into the world of disaster resilience and preparedness it started with the fact that I've been poor most of my life, and particularly most of my adult life. And if you look at how disasters are defined, they're when something happens, when some crisis happens that overwhelms the community's ability to respond, and so they need outside help to recover. So that can be big disasters or little disasters. And my life had a number of little disasters in them, and I was quite resilient in those disasters. And people started questioning how, and so I had opportunities to look at that. But I really cut my teeth as an earth firster, an environmental activist, and really looking at that connection of humans and how we interface with our world and how our relationship is with the planet. And I'm from the era of John Seed and the Council of All Beings, and really looking at how humans' actions impact the world around us and how that then again re-impacts the human beings and that cyclical thing. Some years into that, I was introduced to permaculture through Starhawk. Permaculture to me was a great framework for much of the stuff that of the traditional knowledge out there that, you know, as a child of somebody who was raised on a farm by a depression era parents, there was a lot of skill sets involved in that kind of survival and making do. So I came into permaculture with that perspective, and it's like, oh, here's something that really puts the pieces together in a way that is comprehensible and teachable and learnable, because it talks about that connection with the wild and with the land and with agriculture and people, and really integrates us all together. And so much of what you find in the outside world separates people from the world around them, the natural world around them. And so permaculture brought those things together for me. And it was food systems, it was ways of thinking about responses, and ways of thinking about dealing with energy. So I came into it as an activist. I started doing street medic stuff, which is responding to large protests, which are, you know, a disaster in motion once the police come in. All the wilderness I got to a wilderness first responder course, because when you're in a protest situation, you are in a wilderness situation, which is defined by more than an hour for medical care. So you can be a half a mile from a hospital in a protest and still be more than an hour for medical care, depending on where the police lines are and whether they'll let you through and how you can get through them. So that was kind of a pull. And then the street medics I was working with, when Katrina happened and other natural disasters started happening, we started talking about how we could provide mutual aid. And so my approach to disasters is that mutual aid approach to disasters. So I got into it from there. And then through getting my undergrad in my 40s with a teenager, I ended up homeless and in California, which was a great opportunity to practice many of my skills. But out of that, we built because we had a lot of people asking us to teach what we knew. So we developed a permaculture demonstration bus that had a lot of permaculture systems and principles built into it. And we traveled the country for several years talking to people. And one of the things I learned is that you can talk to people in the suburbs about rainwater catchment and gray water and human manure till the cows come home and they kind of roll their eyes. But if you say, this is disaster preparedness, they're like, oh, we could have a disaster. I want to be prepared. So a lot of the permaculture technology was really easily taught in a disaster preparedness framework to people who would otherwise not be interested in those skill sets. And with the street medic stuff, working on disasters and looking at how effective it was as a training tool, I decided to go back to grad school, and I got a graduate degree in interdisciplinary studies with a focus on disasters. And so I looked at them from a public health perspective, from a geographical perspective, from an educational perspective. So I just popped around all the colleges and found any grad stuff on disasters and put together this training plan, because what I've learned through my activism and through college is that, first of all, the first responders to disasters are the people in them. All the extra help takes time to come. So if you're in a disaster, you're the one that gets to set the tone. You're the one that is responding in the first place. So your knowledge and your community's knowledge and your connections to your community were vital. So it's like, how can we do that? How can we spread this knowledge in our communities? What is the vital knowledge to know? And then how can we build our community to respond to disasters? And so the further I got into it, it's just like, this is really important work. And if you look at disasters in the country, you can, in the world, you can see they're going up and up and up. I just had to pull up a statistic today because it was a few years since I looked at any statistics. But one of these statistics I found really interesting is that there was an average of 3.3 year disasters that cost over $1 billion in damage, and this is all adjusted for 2024 dollars, to 17 plus in 2014. And as of November of this year in 2024, there have been 24 confirmed disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion each in the United States alone. So you look at that number, 24 so far in the United States alone. So it's a growing market, it's a growing problem and a growing opportunity. And I really look at disasters as an opportunity because in a stable system, change is really hard to make. In an unstable system, changes are a little bit of change. You know, and I often have taught this by having, stand there really strong with both feet on the ground, and then, somebody pushes you and it's really hard to move you. But if you're standing on one foot on the ball of your toe and somebody touches you with a finger, you can fall over. So disasters to me are something to look at as an opportunity to create the communities we crave. When everything breaks, how do we put it back together? How do we prepare for putting things back together? What is it we need to know to do that and to respond in real time? And so this is where my love and interest in disasters is that how do we respond and how do we be resilient in these, not just survive, but be resilient and make things grow and be better. So this is where I come at from disasters, and I'm excited to talk about this and answer questions.
Well, that's a great lead into maybe the first question that I would like to pose to the two of you. And it really comes around what we're seeing around the increase in disasters. So both in frequency, we're seeing like things that hit the Carolinas and Florida, fires in California and BC. We're seeing the floods in Spain, and you look, in the Philippines or Uganda, like there's these disasters that are getting more frequent and they're getting larger. And my question to you all is, what is it, one or two things people should really think about in their own personal lives around preparing for or conceptualizing these disasters that might strike their home or their space? So what do you have to offer folks for kind of starting to think about how to hold that as people look at where they live and in their particular situations? And maybe Delyla, if you want to lead us off, and then Chris can follow up.
Okay. So for me, it's all about skills and community, right? So developing skill sets to respond, and all the disaster trainings are like, get 3 days worth of food. And that's a really good idea, unless you have to evacuate and that food isn't movable, unless the food washes down with your house, as you saw in North Carolina. So these little physical preparednesses can be helpful, but really if you develop skills of how do I create a safe, warm, dry space in the middle of a disaster? How do I do medical treatment for people around me because no medical systems can come in? Those skill set developments are really important. And community, because the people who are going to be responding, the first responders to the disasters that you're in, are going to be your neighbors and your community members. So building community around disasters and developing specific skill sets are really, to me, the two big things that you can do. And I can talk about, I'll talk a little bit about that more later. But one of the things I noticed about North Carolina that I found really interesting, and this happens in every disaster, FEMA comes in and everybody's like, and Red Cross comes in and they're like, oh, they've taken over the response. Oh my God, you know, they're not letting people in. And I strongly believe that everybody takes the FEMA CERT course, because not because that their information is great or that they have any real, you know, it's very useful, but if you have that cert when they come in, you now have a position in their line of command, their chain of command that they can understand. And you've met your neighbors who are also interested in it. So it's a community building exercise and gives you a skill set and something that you can help in that response. So for me, it's about what you do in your community and in your brain more than the physical preparedness outside of you. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. I'm going to come back to what Delyla was first sharing, when they started off chatting a few moments ago. And I love that comment you made about, you kind of are the first responder if you're there, because there's always this delay before, the additional help comes. And, one of the things that's got me really passionate about this more kind of grassroots approach and this community-led approach to emergency response, preparedness, all these things, is actually coming from having spent a number of years working in formal emergency management, working literally with governments and hydro, and actually realizing, how vulnerable some of those systems are and how, unprepared are. I'll just say it this way, a lot of the, our governments have some phenomenal systems in place, but there's also a lot of holes. And really, in some ways, I think they have an almost impossible job when you really think about it. So I do actually have some compassion. I'm not saying this as like a harsh critic. The job is almost impossible, but from working on the inside and running mock disaster scenarios with some pretty large municipalities and government organizations, they often don't do great when we run these disaster scenarios. There's a lot of things get missed. And all of that really empowers me to say, wow, as a local community, we really are the first responders. And we want to do our best to be able to put those systems in place to really take care of each other out there, and then, if larger responses are able to come to us, the better we have our kind of shit together, the less of a liability we are for them, the more time they are to actually help, maybe more needy people, or to get to the root of the problems, or to start clearing infrastructure. The less prepared we are as citizens, the more time those responders are dealing with us and helping us. So it really is like a communal effort, I think. And I think we have the ability to weave in some of those holes, those holistic pieces that are often missing. I think, when we start weaving in like the connection to the land and the relationship pieces and the social justice pieces and some of these other layers, So it's not quite an answer to the question, though. I'll come back to that. I just kind of wanted to highlight on that piece and why I thought it was really relevant. I guess the piece I would share for folks tonight, so here in Canada, every single municipality is required by law to have an emergency plan, an emergency disaster plan. It's mandated, and part of my job was actually working with municipalities and creating these. Very few families or small communities or businesses have their own emergency plan, though. And I really think it makes a lot of sense for us as households, for us as groups of families, for us as groups of friends, for us as NGOs, for us as farms, whatever the project we're involved with is, to actually learn from that and think, it would actually make sense that, if all of my neighbors, if every house on my block or in my neighborhood had a family plan, and their plan actually had conversations with the other people around them that had plans, man, that would go a long ways. So many people I know, and I think we're chatting with the converted here, are highly aware of climate change. They've been fighting and taking part in activism activities for, decades, some of us, to try and prevent some of the worst case scenarios. But at the same time, when I look around, at least in my circles, of a lot of the people who, consider themselves activists, earth conscious people that are trying to prevent damage from being done, I see very few of them actually being proactive with the reality that the climate is actually already changing drastically. Like, we're already there. And a lot of people are not acting in their lives and making choices based on that. The next 20 years are not going to look like the last 20 years. And it really is the time now to actually wake up to that and start doing things proactively about that. We can get into like, what does it look like to make a plan for your family throughout this night. I mean, we're going to be diving deep into that in the one course that I'm running later this winter, that Charles put the link in there for. So the emergency planning class. But I think all families and communities could have a plan in place and start to think proactively. I started working on mine almost 2 decades ago. And when I first started, I had no clue what I was doing. I just knew that I was worried and I had some concerns. And I started breaking it down into kind of like short term, middle term, and long term goals and plugging away. And I would forget about it literally for like a couple of years sometimes. And I'd be like, oh, yeah, I started working on this whole planning process. And it's kind of neat. I've actually been reviewing some of my notes in the last couple of months because I've been kind of feeling this urgency to take that plan to the next level. And it's amazing after a kind of almost a couple decades, how many of those original things that I dreamed of and thought, oh, that would make so much sense, but like, how am I ever going to do that? Or I don't even know what that looks like. I don't have the knowledge. And jump forward a decade, it's like, oh, wow, like a lot of those I've actually checked the box off and they're in place right now. And it feels really, really good. Yeah, so I'll maybe leave it there for right now. That was a pretty broad answer, but I think we're going to get a little more specific as the conversation goes on tonight. So
Yeah, I want to bring us a little more into specifics around what people can do in their communities. So, like Chris, I love what you had to say about, oh, what's our plan in our households, like in our units, whether it's our business or our work or our community. But like, I'm curious what you think are some of the things that people can do in their local communities, in their neighborhoods, maybe in their cities, maybe if you have a cluster of houses that work together with, or depending on your unit. But like, what are some of the local things people can be doing that can really make a difference?
Why don't we do this one, Chris?
oh, I missed what Delyla said there.
You want to go ahead and lead on this one?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I missed that. I thought you were starting to talk. I somehow gapped out that one. Sure. There's almost like two different directions I could go with this one. And one level is the real kind of like permaculture resilience place. How do we actually support ecological integrity in our communities, which I think is a big part of the solution and really the permaculture lens. The other lens I could go is kind of almost more the like kind of tactical preparedness approach. And I think I'm going to kind of go that way right now, although I hope that we'll have some time to more speak about that like ecological lens as well, because I think they're so relevant. And bridging those two is actually kind of why I got out of professional emergency management and trying to do this more like holistic work that I see myself doing now. So I'll give you one example, on a more tactical level. So, one of the tool sets that we often use in the realm of permaculture is this principle of observe and interact. And we often do a lot of mapping, we might map out, how energy flows across the landscape or how water flows across the landscape. We might map, how sun moves across the landscape and how it impacts soil and microclimates. And then we're designing our food systems and our garden systems around that, right? So taking those same principles of observation and mapping, we could actually apply that to where are we vulnerable. So I literally I've done this a number of times now, and I just did it again a couple of days ago. So I sat down one morning with my morning coffee, and I got out a pen and my notebook, and I basically started going down and making a list of like, okay, here are some of the things that I am reliant on the outside world for, like highly reliant on. For example, like electricity coming into my home right now. So I started as a flow chart. Okay, electricity comes into my home, and then where does it go? Okay, well, it goes into my fridge, it goes into my oven, it goes into the water pump, which then where does the water go? Okay, well, the water goes into my toilet, it goes into my sink, it goes to water a garden, it goes to our animals to drink, and it goes for us to drink. Oh, and I need it to bathe as well, so my shower. And I literally just kind of started mapping these lines, and it ended up being quite a wide chart of like, okay, electricity, and it flows out to this, and water, and it flows out to this, and then there's food, and there's, what resources do I rely on outside sources for, where I have to leave my home to go and get them. So it started off with quite a large list, and then I started thinking, okay, which of these are actually vulnerable to being kind of cut off? And sure enough, all of them were to some degree, some more so than others. So then I've got this framework that I learned through emergency management that I really like. Up here in Canada, we call it the 5 pillars. And it's this idea of, prevent, mitigate, prepare, respond, recover. So the prevention one is looking at a bunch of these. Okay, if I recognize that, energy coming into the house could be cut off, or maybe there could be a surge, too much of it. It could go the other way. So you can either have not enough or an excess. That's the same with water. It's the same with power. It's the same with a lot of things. So anyways, I identify energy and I say, okay, can I prevent issues with energy from happening in the first place? And maybe there's a few ways. I look around my property. I'm like, oh wow, well there's some trees with dying limbs by the power line over there, or maybe there's some poplar growing over there, which are a tree that's very susceptible to damage in a windstorm. Maybe I want to actually think about cutting out the poplar there and growing something like an oak tree up in that place, which might actually support the ecology better, but is less likely to break a branch in a power storm. So that would be an example of prevention, thinking about, how do I harden off the power system coming in so it's less likely to be taken out in a windstorm to begin with. Or, a power surge. It's like, okay, do I have surge protectors for my computer that I'm with here tonight? That's preventing something from happening. The next one we move into, though, is the idea of mitigation. It's like, okay, if I can't prevent something from happening, well, how do I reduce the impact of it? And are there things I can put in place to reduce the impact of it? I might not be able to prevent a wildfire starting in my region. I might not be able to prevent my neighbor's house from catching on fire. I might be able to mitigate the damage across the property that I tend, though, and that I get to be a caretaker of. And there's actions I could take to mitigate that. I could apply that, though, to flooding. I could apply that to financial collapse. Like, I could apply it to so many different scenarios, right? So that's mitigate. And then prepared is like, okay, what things do I want to have in place? So if this happens, I'm ready to go. And then, that kind of falls into the response idea. What are my actual plans for how we're going to respond in the time? What do we need in place to support us afterwards? So what I would suggest that everyone here do is literally start to just make a map. Where are those things that you were really reliant on? Which ones do you think are vulnerable to some of the hazards you're most concerned about? And are there things you can start to do to prevent, mitigate, prepare, adapt, prevent with those potential hazards coming in? Give me a half second. I want to just look at my note for a second because I did come up with a couple thoughts around that one specifically. Okay, yeah, here's an example one. So for example, so we live on a small little homestead. We grow quite a bit of food that we're able to put around. We're very privileged and I'm thankful to be able to do that. We also have some relationships with some local farmers and we get a full pig, or sorry, half pig every year. And we get a half of or a full lamb. We raise rabbits, we raise chickens. So we have 2 chest freezers that are full of meat and vegetables that are a big part of our food for the year. Very, very important to us. And we recognize that, those, although it's amazing and feels somewhat sustainable that we're able to grow this food or get it locally to feed ourselves, which is reducing our carbon footprint, at the same time, it's reliant on this larger electrical grid. And if that electrical grid, goes down for a short time or even a longer time, that food could then become a liability for us. So we've actually realized, so if I was to, again, kind of apply it to these different layers, well, one thing that I could do with it is, what's a backup power supply that I create myself? Can I have a generator? Can I have solar? Can I have micro hydro? Whatever. That would be one layer that I could weave into my system there. But maybe that's not practical, or maybe I do want that, but I also want to think about other things as well. Because, in a longer term disaster, I'm only going to run my generator for so long. My solar panels are still vulnerable to technological failure. And what we really realize, if we really want to be more resilient and hardy, freezing that much food is actually just a huge liability in the first place. And we really need to actually increase our skill sets around canning, around drying. And by increasing our skill sets around theirs, we're also reducing our carbon footprint because now we're needing to run less electricity into the house in the first place through other means. So we've actually been really doubling down. We kind of came to this epiphany a couple of years ago. So we've actually been really focused on how do we increase our food preservation skill set as an actual mitigation and preparedness measure, knowing that our freezer is actually a vulnerability to us in a disaster. So I can just keep going off there, but why don't I pass it over to you there, Delyla?
All right. I love to talk about layering because I think that's a lot of it for in my experience is that, first of all, I want to define resilience. It's a word we throw around a lot, and I've looked at a lot of definitions of it, and I have one that I use that I really like, which is just really the ability to weather life's trials and tribulations with some dignity and grace. Right? We need to be resilient. You know, you look at the Irish people, and the Irish people were wiped out. More than 50% of their population was wiped out over three times over an 800-year period. And every 50 years, they just simply rose up and fought against the English again. And they had more babies, and 50 years later, they had enough people to do it again. And they did that for 800 years until they won, pretty much. So that resilience of being able to find space where you can have some dignity of grace when everything falls apart, and you can respond to what's in front of you. So it's not just, resilience isn't just survival. You know, we see a lot of stuff about survival. Resilience is about survival with benefits, survival with being able to hold on to ourselves and our humanity. You know, I'm on a lot of survival lists. You know, I play in that, dabble in that world where a lot of right-wing or preppers do. I discovered the difference between a homesteader and a prepper, or a permaculturist and a prepper is, you know, your politics. You're a prepper if you're right wing. You tend to be more of a homesteader if you're a little bit lefty. So I found that really interesting. So when thinking about how we prepare for disasters, we need to think about how we're preparing not just for survival, which those 3-day kits might give you, but for being resilient in the disasters. So I liked how you were talking about food preparation. We were in a disaster. The fire was coming upon our place in Montana. We were the next place to be evacuated. We had 3 freezers. And it's like, okay, we look around this property and we hold a huge amount of wealth in our freezers. You know, compared to what we have in the real world, and freezers are a huge amount of wealth. We did an evacuation plan for our freezers, because even if the fire doesn't hit our house, they shut the power off, we lose all of that. But the second option is, I know how to can meat. If my freezers go down, I'm breaking out the canner. I can can meat over a wood fire, with a pressure cooker, any day of the week. All I have to do is find some wood I can get going. It doesn't even have to be that dry, to bring the pressure cooker up. So I can take the stuff from my freezer and turn it and preserve it through drying or freezing or those other things. So that's a stacked function. Much of my life is disaster preparedness. I live in a rural place, off-grid, with substandard housing. So we have levels of electricity and electrical ability to create light and heat and cooking. So we want to have all different levels of that. So if one system fails, we have another. And that's how you develop resilience, is you stack systems and knowledge on top of it. And there's areas, you know, somebody popped this into the chat, and to me, this is a really good place to put it, because I just want to make sure I get them all. Yes, because, and this is something what my graduate project was, how we can go to communities and do community resilience training that are interactive with the community. So instead of going in and saying, I have this training, which is what CERT does, you go in and say, what are the problems? What are the things you have going for you? Okay, how can we help you solve your problem for disaster response? And how can we help you build on what you're doing for you? And then creating curriculum that is community specific, because disasters are community specific. But there's some things that you really need to hold on to. And permaculture technology, things like gray water, human manure. One of my favorite lines is when talking to people, it's like, most people in this world cannot go to the bathroom safely without their government's assistance, particularly in the United States, Europe, developed countries, unless they have the government to take away their sewer, to make sure they have water for their toilets. They don't know how to safely go to the bathroom if there's 3 days or more where there's no water and stuff like that. It quickly becomes a problem. So this is where permaculture technology is a great thing to know. Wilderness medicine protocols. Your standard EMT, your standard first aid class isn't much good. It's all based on the idea that you're 15 minutes from help. And when you're in a disaster, you're days from help. So having some wilderness medical protocols in there. Community organizing skills. You've got to be able to work. Disasters are not something that can be done alone by one person. They're a community response. And so being able to organize in your community, knowing how to listen to people, knowing how to pick out people who have skill sets and help them utilize those skill sets are all really good, useful things in a disaster. And then some transnational advocacy. One of the big things I've watched it in Katrina. I've watched it in fires in California. I watched it in North Carolina when Helena hit, is that people don't plan and prepare to engage with those multinational. There's a whole disaster. You talk about a governmental and nonprofit war-bound disaster response that happened. You know, they went into Haiti and they dumped billions of dollars and completely destroyed the farming community because they gave away free food. And if the community would have been able to find a way to say, tell you what, give the local cooks the food and they will cook it in, and pay the local farmers that are from out of the disaster area to bring food in really cheap. And so the farmers are getting money. So now the farmers outside of the disaster are actually receiving some income. That food can be used in disaster response instead of having, GMO soy shipped in from the United States to Haiti. They could have been paying Haitian farmers. But that would have required really good community organizing and people within the community to have good transnational competency and how to engage with these different organizations that come in. So these are the skill sets that I think we need. And then when we look at our landscape with disasters, we can look around and say, what are the disasters in my area? And understand you can prepare and you can prepare and you can spare and you can prevent. And that doesn't mean something's not going to come over your shoulder that nobody ever saw coming and knock you off. But it means that when you bounce back, you're more resilient. You have things in place. You understand if you have a flood and you know that your area is prone to flooding, there's things you can do to prevent that. And there's also things you can do to make it easier to bounce back. You can have flood resistant plants in the ground that you know that even if they get dumped into water, that when the water recedes, they will grow again and provide you with food. In California, I moved to California, spending a lot of time creating shaded fuel breaks along our roadways, along our housing areas, and they just every season they just go back a little bit further and a little bit further. And so it's a process to creating this space of resilience. Getting to know your neighbors again. I have to keep coming back to that because disasters are a community with problems. So those are the things. I kind of lost the question a little bit in there.
It's great.
But so in the smaller scale, it still comes back to getting to know your neighbors, having some really solid skill sets, and layering everything. Don't just have one source of drinking water. Don't assume that if you have a bunch of drinking water stored in your bathtub and all of those, in places and barrels around your place, that when the flood comes through, those water sources are going to be good. You probably also want to have a backpack water filter so that if your big sources of water are unavailable, you can now filter the crappy water that you have available to you into something that is drinkable. So that layering of skill sets, that having many, and we do that in permaculture. You don't just put one thing in, you don't monocrop. And so we don't want to monocrop our disaster response either. We want to make sure everything is in layers. So check.
Yeah.
Can I actually just jump in really quick there, Charles? I
Yeah.
wanted to highlight two things there, just feeding off you there. First off, I wanted to come back to something you said earlier when you were talking about, in disaster, there's also opportunity. And something that I've thought a lot about, and you already kind of referenced this, is this idea that, there's so much infrastructure that we have in place that is so unsustainable and really isn't serving us in a holistic way. And it's not serving future generations, that's for sure. But there's so much invested in it that, a lot of us that have been in the activism world for decades realize how hard it is to create change in it sometimes. Disasters can pull these things down really fast sometimes. And there's an interesting psychological thing here where in crisis, people tend to cling to what they had before, even if what before wasn't serving them, because it was normal and it was comfortable. And it might not have been good, or it might not have felt comfortable at the time, but it's what you're used to, so you cling to it. So in these moments of disaster, what we're seeing here often, and I see this when you can look at this with like the multiple hurricanes that we've seen down in the States, and we keep seeing infrastructure getting wiped out, and then people going back and building this thing the same way. And then it happened. And maybe there's little tweaks that happen, and little tactical improvements that happen, and a couple building codes get changed or whatever. But I think what we're talking about is some fundamental shifts to design that really need to happen if we're going to serve people and the planet in a different way. And I loved your example, talking about Haiti there, in a response there where it's like, hey, we're not utilizing local farmers, or our response might even be hurting some of these local networks because we're missing this holistic element. And that's what gets me really excited about the grassroots community component of this, as we have the opportunity to build those relationships now and to build something very different that once the system calls down, and this is a really important piece, because if we wait until things come down and then we try to build it different, there's actually a pretty decent chance that things are going to get pulled back the way they were. It's just like a natural psychological response. But we have an opportunity right now, knowing some of these systems are going to be probably taken out, that if we're preparing now with better solutions on a grassroots level, and then hopefully even influencing on a government level, there's an opportunity to actually implement that change in a better way. So there is a really beautiful opportunity there. And then the other one I wanted to just say, for anyone that's starting to feel overwhelmed, because we're already talking about, oh, for water, this, and you want this system, and I've made this big elaborate map. Pretty quickly, it's easy to get overwhelmed and be like, oh my goodness, that's so much. I feel so unprepared. I'm just going to go back to ignoring this issue. So I wanted to just throw a quick little tip there. If you're in the like, oh my goodness, this sounds like a lot step. One of it is just that, this stuff compounds over time. Just like building a garden. When we first started our homestead, we had sandy soil and it was just a ton of work and no food. 6-7 years later, it was like, oh my goodness, there's food everywhere and the systems are feeding into each other and it's building soil. We could take a year off and there would still be a garden out there now. It compounds slowly over time. So first off, don't be discouraged. What's important is to do something instead of nothing. Who cares whether it's perfect? The second part I would say is, if you're in that overwhelmed place, thinking about stacking functions and other permaculture principles, like, what actions could I take that actually set me up to be supportive in multiple different possible scenarios? Then I'm taking leaps forward instead of getting caught in the nitty gritty of specifics. I can get really focused on like how to prepare my house for an earthquake, and then the earthquake doesn't come and something else happened. But, you mentioned first aid multiple times as like such an important skill set. Like there's a great example. Almost every disaster, large scale disaster, has a component of a need for first aid in response. Being higher trained in first aid is something that now makes you more resilient to multiple different, I shouldn't say more resilient, maybe that's the wrong word, but more of an asset to multiple different possible scenarios when you don't know which one is going to play out. So what are other things in your life that you could do? Small steps you could take? What are the low hanging fruit that kind of get you ahead quickly and allow you to apply it to multiple different possibilities? I hope that kind of makes sense. And again, this is like the course we're going to do this winter. We're going to really dive into the specifics of it, but I think you should be able to run with that hopefully a little bit as well.
Yeah. So I want to add one thing to this conversation and then move on. And slowly I'm going to bring us to more into like details. But the one piece I'd add for people who are watching and listening to this is there's another piece to the disaster kind of response thing, is like we often focus on the people who the I'm in disaster, like my house got flooded, my house got stormed, whatever, I'm in the fire, like that, which is important because you don't want to be a liability. You want to actually be able to not be more of the problem. But also, I think that more often you will be the community next door. You'll be taking in people who have been impacted, and part of disaster response is being like, how am I a good ally? How am I good at mutual aid and support? Because more of us will more often be the community that people have to come into out of disaster, and then they're going to try to go back to their homes, and they're going to need support going back because they have nothing to go. Like, you have the resource as the person who wasn't impacted. So we also can design around, how am I this support network for all of my friends and community neighbors and neighboring communities? And that's a very much a social design and is an equally important part. So we want to make sure we're not going to become liabilities as much as we can by developing all these skills. But we also want to think about how can we be the neighbor next door that is able to take people in and then help them get back into their homes, because that's a critical thing. And that usually has a long tail after disaster. It can take a long time to do that cleanup. But anyway, don't want to spend a lot of time on that. There was a great question that we had that was sent in earlier. I'd love to get your thoughts on it. It was, from Chris asked about how do you think about navigating one's own mobility and privilege for climate mitigation for strategies uh, uh, of moving basically. So like there is this thing like if you have privilege and access, you can move out of the way of disaster. Be like, okay, I don't want to live here, floodplain, storms, fires, whatever, and move to safer place, or staying in place and trying to do things to mitigate it. Like, what's your thought about staying versus moving, or like how to deal with that kind of range of mobility that people have because of their life background, but also what choices people make around staying versus moving out of disaster prone areas?
So my first thought on that question, I read that question, and my first thought on it was kind of a snarky one, which is the world is changing quickly and you no longer get to do that. One of the safest places in the United States is actually North Carolina. They're not prone to flooding. They don't get hurricanes. They don't, you look at Oklahoma, it's like the toilet bowl of the natural disasters. They get everything, winter storms and ice storms and heat waves and everything. But you go a little further over towards North Carolina, and they are considered to be a fairly safe disaster. They get some rains and stuff like that, but they don't get the hurricanes of the coast. They don't get the tornadoes of the Midwest. They don't get the freezing ice storms of above usually. And so, to your privilege, I say there's pretty much no place else to go. The fancy houses in the Hollywood Hills are sliding down the mountain, right, as well as the poor people's houses. Everybody's sliding down the mountain. So more and more it's becoming impossible. Missoula, Montana, so many people are like, I'm going to Montana. First of all, they have freezing sub-zero temperatures, but they had 85, 90 mile an hour winds, which they don't have there, and buildings fell down and trees fell, and they had power was out for 4 or 5 days. They had a lot of injuries in that area. No place is safe anymore. There is no place your privilege can take you that will exempt you from the natural disasters that are here and are coming. So wherever you are, you need to start working with your neighbors and figuring out how to make it work. And you can try to move to places that are less disaster prone, and you may find that your neighbors there are more difficult to work with, because many people have said, well, if I move here, I can hunker down and not deal with anybody, and that's going to make you more vulnerable. So every place has its costs and its benefits. And to assume that privilege is going to, and this is one of the things that I find very interesting about this political time, is that people say, if I deny climate change, which is hilarious to me, because if you talk to them, they don't actually deny climate change, they deny the cause of climate change. They say, we're not having climate change because of people, we're having all these exasperated weather events because it's just the natural cycle of the climate that has happened. It happened to the dinosaurs, and it's like, yes, but then it's still happening to us, regardless of who or why you think it caused it. So, to that I say, wherever you are, start working with your neighbors, because there is no place on this planet anymore that you can go where you're really truly going to be safe for any length of time. The people in Italy thought that they were perfectly safe in their little town before it flooded. People in North Carolina are like, we don't get hurricanes. We're hundreds of miles from the coast, but they did. And it took out a huge set of their infrastructure. So I think we just need to get over that idea that there's an escape if you have enough money, because there isn't. And so we need to stay where we are, and we need to use our resources and our privilege to start creating infrastructure that includes, the mutual aid infrastructure that includes all the people in our community, regardless of their resources and their privilege or their lack of privilege, and make sure that everybody in our neighborhood is taken care of, because you never know when that person who doesn't seem like they'd be any benefit in a disaster just has that specialty knowledge that you just happen to need at that moment. So, you have to keep that in mind. I don't think there is an escape anymore. You got anything on that, Chris?
That was awesome, actually, for an answer. It's kind of neat to think about that. It's not so much about escaping. It's, you're trading one thing for another, and you potentially don't know what you're trading, when you leave your region and go from one area to another. But there are, threats that exist everywhere. There's opportunities that exist everywhere. I guess the only other layer I would throw into that, if you're still in a place of navigating, well, you know, I'm right on the coast, and I'm just feeling like it doesn't make sense for me to live on a coast anymore, and I want to go inline. I think, like Delyla said there, it would make it's important to recognize that, okay, by leaving the coast, you know what, how is it going to change, and what other challenges and opportunities might exist there? You know, maybe it's my neighbors are more challenging when I move. Maybe it's now I got to worry about droughts instead of hurricanes. So things change. Two other pieces I think that are just really interesting to throw in there for perspective, though, you know, is that humans, you know, if you want to zoom way out historically, have actually moved and traveled as a result of changes in climate for very long periods of time. The Anishinaabe peoples of my area, and this is really fascinating. You know, we don't have time to really dive into the teachings, and nor am I the one to share them or dive into them in depth. But you know, they have stories about when the big glaciers came and then when they receded again in their oral lineage. It's actually fascinating because their traditional stories challenge the idea that their ancestors came over the land bridge, because they're like, no, we remember when the ice came, not just when it receded. Like, we have the stories about when the ice came here in the first place, but their peoples actually moved as glaciers covered the continent, you know, and then they moved back as the glaciers went back. And if you ever get to sit in on some of those stories, it's really, really fascinating. I got to sit in on one around a Monument just recently, and you know, that this prophecy that was given around the seven nations going and finding wild rice, Monument, and independently they all did and settled in these areas of Monument. So just one little piece there, that you know, there is something natural about people being like, hey, there's a threat there, I'm going to move further away about it too. So that's not necessarily inherently bad. And then when you think about the privilege piece, it's like, oh, well, maybe I have the resources, but my neighbor can't. You know, that really comes down to, you know, personal vision and the story that you're fulfilling in life, you know? And I think about that, like I'm from the suburbs. I now live in the country because nothing else makes sense to me. I just don't imagine myself living anywhere else. You could look at some of the choices I make and probably call me a prepper, but I don't actually consider myself a prepper because, you know, I'm not necessarily worried about like the doomsday apocalypse and the zombie apocalypse and shit hitting the fan in that kind of way. And I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole. That's not what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about design and my choices. Where I'm going with this story is I've chose to live in the country. And if things got really bad, I actually plan to go and support my family down south. So I'm going to walk into the fire. That's a personal vision, and that's why I don't call myself a prepper. I'm not going to run to the hills. I'm gonna stay with my family and the people I love, and that's a decision. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong. What I'm saying is that, you know, I think part of your question is like really tapping in, like, what is your purpose here on this planet? What is your personal vision? And I can't actually answer that or speak to you whether you should stay where you are or whether you should go. But I would encourage you to think about your purpose and your vision, and where is your work in the world going to best be served, or where are you going to best serve the world? And maybe it's where you are in the hurricane area, or maybe it's over in the desert in the droughts. And that's your work to do. So that would be my answer.
So we've got a few more questions that people sent in, and we got some in the chat. I just want to take a moment and see if there are questions from the group that people have. I'm going to read off one from the chat, but if you have a question, I'm going to kind of open it up for questions after this one. So Lexington asked about, is there an ideal configuration of people slash skill sets that are good to have? You know, like, should everybody have first aid? And then like some people have specialized skills, or are there constellations of skill sets and kind of, or teams? Like, how do you perceive of, you were starting to talk about skill sets early on, and kind of what are some of the critical skill sets either that everybody should have or that should be collectively had within a group of people?
Or you can go. People have good things to say.
It's funny. It actually makes me think. Some of you may be familiar with the place called Our Eco Village out on the west coast of Canada. Yeah, a really cool little farmstead and eco village that's been out there for a long time. And I actually got reconnected with Earth activist training because I was doing some emergency consulting work with the village there years ago. And as part of the consulting work I was doing, we actually hosted a community event and brought all the neighbors in. And we actually did a community assets bingo game. You know, it's that like, has anyone ever played that game where you're like, it's like the icebreaker game where you've got like a sheet and it's like, who can do a handstand and who speaks 3 languages and who can best quote The Simpsons or whatever, just like random stuff they put on those. So we basically made one of those charts, but it was kind of the list that you're talking about in this question. You know, so we had questions on there like, you know, who has experience caring for the elderly? Who has a higher level of first aid? Who knows how to use a chainsaw and owns a chainsaw? You know, who has a, you know, ham radio license? So we basically came up with all of these different skill sets. And then at a community event, used it as an icebreaker. And it was actually really fun. And through this game, suddenly we were starting to kind of map the assets that we had in our community. So yes, there absolutely is a list that I have. I mean, I could ring some more off the top of my head. I actually have that list written down though, and I've refined it over time, and other people have versions of it. And then as to like the specialist versus generalist, I mean, I feel like there's some foundational skills that you kind of want everybody to have a baseline level of. And then everybody is going to have their personal vision and gifts that they go deep with. And that's the specialist part that you bring to the community, you know? So I do think like everybody should have some foundational first aid skills, because who knows who's going to be the first on site. But not everybody's going to be a doctor or a naturopath or, you know, the first, even the medic for that matter, you know? So someone in your crew, it's pretty important to have some people that have gone deeper down the rabbit hole with learning medical skills, both modern and traditional. You know, I think about things like herbalism and stuff like that. But a baseline in that is really helpful for everybody. Yeah, but I could keep going. You know, there's all kinds of things that I could line off in that list there. I mean, it'd be interesting. You know, we could even do that in the chat right now. Everybody could just throw in like, what is one skill set you think that would be valuable, and then we would have the start of a list right there. So that's what I'll share right now. But why don't, yeah, share in the chat. You know, what would be one thing you would add to that list that you think would be valuable?
And while you do that, I'll talk about it a little bit. One of the ways I look at, and I absolutely agree, the idea that we have that people have a base skill set. So everybody should know how to stop a bleed. Somebody's bleeding out, everybody should know how to well-aimed direct pressure and stop a bleed until somebody who can do more gets there. But it's great to have people who can do more. But I like to go back to, they talk about this rule of threes in medicine. You can go 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without heat, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food before you become seriously impacted by those things. So I like to start there. And it's like, okay, we should know how to provide ourselves with at least some sort of shelter and some sort of heat, if need be, almost immediately. We should know that. And within our community, we need people who will be able to help us provide us with clean water and figure out clean water, because that's going to be a need pretty quick. And then you can start looking, once you get through those rules of threes, which is basic survival, you can start looking at that, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, okay, what do we need next, you know, in our system? So when looking at developing skill sets, and what knowledge we have, looking at those basic needs, how do I provide for these basic things in an environment? And so having those personally, so you can provide yourself with food and shelter and some basic medical care in your immediate surroundings, is a fabulous thing. But then also getting together with your neighbors, like, okay, I can throw up, I can grab a tarp and I can create a little space, but who in my community actually can go take the stuff from the junk that has been created by the disaster and turn it into something that resembles some sort of sustainable housing? You know, who are the herbalists? You know, and I've done a lot in the medic world, and what I've really come to believe is the failing of our system is that we have, you know, now we have nurse practitioners and then we have doctors. And really, you know, in our medic systems, you know, I'm a medic and people came to me for certain things. And then I had people that I worked with who were ER nurses and herbalists. And so when it was beyond my skill set, I sent it up the chain. And it was beyond their skill set, they sent it up to the doctors that work with us, so they sent it to the right places. So having that depth in your, I'm going to use a baseball reference, in your bullpen, even though I'm not really a baseball person, having some depth in your skill sets in your community is critical. And you never know when that, if you're the only person that knows that, or you only know one person who knows that, that person is going to be impacted by the disaster in ways that they can no longer be efficient. So you want to have several people who do those things. So yeah, basic electrical, the diplomat, somebody's got to be there to talk to FEMA when they come in. You know, you got to find, you know, the most redneck looking white guys. It's like, okay, you're going to go talk to FEMA for us and you're going to keep them busy while we keep doing our thing. You know, and thinking about those things. And part of the skill sets is you develop. I love the skill set bingo. I love games that teach us how we need to think about ourselves. Is just that connection, that finding out what people know and how they know. Reclaiming the one time did within a group that we went to protest with, they did a retreat and they just made a list of what skills everybody had that they could share. So it's like, okay, in this group, we know that if we were in a disaster together, these are the skill sets. And it was actually beyond that. It was like, okay, if we're trying to help people recover, we're trying to help people get better, what skill sets do we have to share? You know, one of the greatest skill sets I saw come out in North Carolina that just tickled me pink is people started bringing in mule teams because there was no road access to where many of the people who needed help in North Carolina were. So one of the skill sets they needed was packers, people who could load up mules with all the supplies they needed and propane tanks and all of that stuff and take them into the backcountry. Wouldn't have been something I would have thought of, but it was incredibly important in North Carolina. So, you know, look at your environment, look at what response is necessary, look at the skill sets you have, and, you know, a basic list of this, and learn some basic stuff yourself. I was in a class once and somebody asked me how prepared I was for the disaster and end times and all of that. We were doing a spectrogram and I went to I am perfectly prepared. And it's like, and I said, I'm perfectly prepared because, well, I don't know how to do everything. I know somebody who does. And that's your trick. Find out somebody who knows how to do all those things. And there are different people in your community. And when you find them and, you know, you tell them what you know, and that's how you start creating a resilient cadre of people who can come out in disasters. And, you know, it's just been fascinating to me to watch the local community response. And I have a number of people from the mutual aid movement who live there who were impacted directly by it. And it's just fascinating to see how it's playing out in real time and how much and how important that mutual aid is in the response.
That's great. You could take that, you know, I started off this class with the very first question. I talked about how I did that map coming into my house where it was like energy and water and then did out those flow charts. Well, each one of those, you know, once you take away the generator or the solar panel and you get into later layers of preparedness, there's actually a skill set associated with keeping each one of those there, right? So you could actually start by making that map of like, hey, here's all the things that I rely on. And then it's like, which ones do I already have the skill set for, or am I able to do something? And then, oh, which ones can't I? Well, who in my community can do that? And then I can do this one for them, right? And it just gives, it's just like a Western brain way of starting to think about the mapping process. And I do, you know, as much as I'm rebellious towards many Western systems, my brain was brought up that way and it works that way at the same time. So in the way that I like to map and think and organize. So.
And I use mutual aid and Charles used mutual aid. And I just want to address that really quick. And to me, that is a large part of that is your mental approach to what you're doing. If I'm going into a disaster area to help somebody out, I'm going as a fellow human being there to give what another human being needs, understanding that there is no power over in that exchange. Because next week I may need them to come to my aid, right? It's mutual. Whereas the government comes in and there is the government and Red Cross and the other kind of organizations come in and there is a top-down organization because that's how the Western world organizes its thinking. It's top-down. And so they're coming in where they are rescuing and they are the heroes of the situation. And that is a very different perspective for me. And so really this addresses the privilege conversation to some degree, as well as the preparedness of understanding that all we're doing is creating networks for mutual aid. We are not, so nobody has to be in charge. Nobody, a doctor is not necessarily more beneficial than somebody who will go out and deal with the human needs. They're both critical to survival in a disaster situation. So we're just mutually there together and making it work as people. Plumbing.
I'm quite curious if there's questions in the group that people have. They can be general ones or they can be super specific. Whatever it is. We've been going for a little while. We probably have about maybe going to do it for 20 more minutes. And so any questions you have, you can raise your hand, put it in the chat.
While we're waiting, Charles, there was one that you had mentioned that I think would be a fun one to just touch on while people are thinking of them or putting them in the chats. But when we were preparing for this call, you had mentioned, one possible conversation that could be interesting is, how do we prepare for the other than human elements of the world in our design, and that's where I really love, because we start to really weave in the strengths of, this permaculture way of thinking and this relational way of being within the landscape. And I wanted to give two examples there quickly, an ecological example and then a more like homestead example of them. So on the ecological example, I've recently connected with an organization here in Ontario called the Forest Gene Conservation Authority. And they've been basically researching they've basically been researching the climate zones and how they're shifting. And they're on the cutting edge of invasive diseases moving across the landscape. And looking at, what tree species are susceptible and are there trees. So for example, we have a tree coming right now, the beech tree, that's being wiped out basically across the whole eastern coast by this thing called beech bark disease. And as part of their work, they're literally working with landowners to watch young beech trees to see if any of the young beech trees show resistance to this beech bark disease. Beech, if you don't know the ecological significance, next to acorns, it's arguably the second most important tree nut in our eastern woodland habitat up here for food, particularly fats and proteins, to get wildlife like bears, turkeys, wolves, coyotes, ravens, blue jays, moose. All these animals feed on the beech nuts to build their fat stores to get them through the cold winters that we have. So it's actually a very significant hit to the ecology of our region, this beech bark disease coming through. So, thinking about, the other kin we share this land with in preparing for climate change and this permaculture approach could be actually, looking for resistance in species that are important ecologically in their seeds, and how do we, and so this organization is literally collecting these seeds as they find them and growing them with the hopes of spreading and repopulating these very ecologically significant pieces. The other one that I had in there is, thinking about even, so where I am, so the beech are all dying and the oak wilt is just south of us. And that would be terrifying because, like, as I said, beech is number 2. Oak is arguably the most significant in the eastern woodland habitat that I am, by probably a long shot. If the oaks all started dying, that would be devastating to wildlife. So I've actually been on our homestead, and through the forest gardening efforts, we've been actually bringing up hickories and hazelnuts that don't historically grow here, but grow just south of here. And none of these are trees where I'm worried about them being invasive up on this part, because we're just on the outskirts of their traditional growing zones. And, I will never get to eat the nuts off of most of these, but I'm thinking about the deer, 50, 100 years from now, if the oaks all get wiped out. And interesting enough, I have a good friend of mine. His name's Caleb Musgrave. He's from Hiawatha First Nation. He's a Anishinaabe, Mississauga Anishinaabe, and one of the knowledge holders for their people. And he was telling me, we've been having some fascinating long conversations lately about how his Anishinaabe people have actually been doing this for thousands of years, tending the forest in a conscious way, adapting to climate change, adapting to diseases, and creating food systems that both provide long-term food for people, but also provide it for wildlife. So forest gardening in and of itself, I think, is a important skill set for a changing climate, both thinking about human food needs, both thinking about reducing carbon footprint, ecological impact, but also thinking about wildlife beyond when I'll even be alive on this planet. So.
Thanks, Chris. I think it's really important to think beyond the human sphere when we talk about disasters. I think we often get human focused. I know I put it on the list, but there's been so many other questions. We can't get to them all. We're going to try, though. We have 2 questions. We have one in the chat and one in the Q&A. Maybe I'll take the one in the chat first, and then we'll come back to Bears that's in the Q&A little box. There's a question about, what are your thoughts on disaster recovery? Not just how to be prepared, but how to begin rebuilding.
That's a big one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll start with that one. I took a CERT course in Cazadero 20 years ago, and I took a CERT course a year ago in Cazadero. and which is a community event response training by FEMA. And I do it because whenever I'm in a community, I do that because then if FEMA rolls in, I can say, I'm a CERT leader, and then I know the language to talk to them about, and they know where I fit in, and I can organize my community and use the right language to get them to move on and not interfere with what we're doing. But one of the big things I noticed is 20 years ago, they're like, do this, and then help will arrive. And then there are the stages of disasters, with recovery being the last one. And it's like, and then recovery comes, and there's going to be these systems and this in place to help you recover. And the last course I took, they kind of got to that last long-term recovery after 3 months. And they're like, and you're pretty much on your own. Don't expect real government help. Don't really expect help. Insurance companies aren't paying out. You're pretty much on your own once the recovery phase starts. There's just not going to be any help, there. And it was really surprising to me that they had gotten to that place on a federal level of in their training, basically laying it out that, recovery is not really going to be supported. They're going to do the basic things. They're going to bring the infrastructure back into place, whether it's relevant or not. They really like their infrastructure. They run telephone wires still after disasters. It's like, I understand the electric grid lines, but why are we putting up telephone wire lines again? How many hard lines do we really need anymore? So the first thing you need to, and again, we're coming back to community, and we're coming back to that kind of mapping of looking at one of the things that really helps this is in your preparedness section. If you've worked with your community that says, if we're in a disaster, what improvements do we want to see in our neighborhood? How do we want to make things better? If we're rebuilding this from scratch, what do we want to have? Because you talk about people of wanting to reach for the known. If you already have plans in place of how to take advantage of that chaos, I love the chaos theory, because that's the basis of the chaos theory is a state in change. Any system in change is in a state of flux, in a state of disaster, in a state of chaos is easily changeable. So if you plan for chaos, you can plan for the changes you want to make. You don't plan for chaos, you fall back onto the old. So, have some ideas in mind of what you want, and don't try to rebuild back to where you were. Try to rebuild to where you're going. And they're not, we often want to go back to that point as opposed to future. And sometimes it's just, bootstrapping it. It's like, okay, it's all gone. I know we lost everything to the fire, and we lost our house. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to clean up. And there's often disaster funds for that. And start look for every single benefit that you can get as a person from a disaster victim. If you're in a neighboring community, help people find every single benefit they can get. Every $50 or $100 or somebody help rebuilding. I mean, there's some organization that has organized, I think the Old Timey Music Association has organized a instrument give back. So anybody who lost an instrument, if they were affected by Helena, can write to them and they will send them a new banjo or whatever to get the musicians playing again. Find out what all those services are. Gather your resources. There's, look online, and people who are trying to support. There's always people like, hey, I have lumber and we have a crew and we're just looking for somewhere to go. Because, you can say a lot of things about Americans that are true, but in a disaster situation, often the best of us come out, and people become really giving and really supportive. And so step into it. Don't be afraid to say yes, and don't be afraid to ask if you need. We're taught in our culture that getting gifting and all of that stuff is wrong, and receiving is wrong. But if you ever give to anybody and that feeling you get, if you refuse to receive, you're denying those other people the opportunity to give and get that feeling you get when you give. So we have to, in a disaster situation, if we want to recover, be comfortable with receiving, be comfortable with understanding what our needs are. And then the other part of it for me is to really find joy where you can. So, I follow a lot of people, and there was somebody who's like, I was in Helena and the water washed a huge tree stump up onto my house. My whole land is trashed. But these 10 tomato plants somehow lived and are producing tomatoes. And what the post was about is they were really excited about their 10 tomato plants that had survived. And so taking those moments to look for the good is psychologically critical. So say yes, look for resources, and make a plan based on what you have. In permaculture, we do that thing where it's like, okay, what on-site resources do we have? We have a project, let's figure out what the problem is, find out what resources we have, and then build from there. And that is the nature of recovery. And again, you're going to look to your community, you're going to look to your neighbors, you're going to look to your fellow citizens, you're going to look for people outside who want to come in and help. And you're going to take advantage of those things because you're not only helping yourself, you're helping the people who are giving them. And don't expect, so many people in the United States just expect the government to come and bail them out. And so the government has failed when they want. But what did I say? $24 billion natural disasters, $1 billion plus natural disasters this year in the United States. There aren't the resources for it. They don't have the people to respond. They can't give everybody enough to rebuild their houses. Insurance companies, you can't get house insurance in California that covers fire. You can't get hurricane. Nobody can afford hurricane insurance in Florida anymore. If the insurance companies will ever sell it, or even sell it to them. So understand that it's going to be you and your community, and say yes.
Yeah, the other one I could add to that too is, is that disaster recovery planning actually starts before the disaster as well too. I mean, there's going to be the organic grassroots that just evolves inevitably out of it. But anything you can do ahead of time to consider, like you had already just mentioned a moment ago, well, what do we want to build back better? Or something we're going to be really focused on the course. So the course that we're running this winter is going to be working with, whether you're a business, you're a farmstead, you're a family, community, NGO, whatever it is, like actually making the emergency plan. So we're going to really dive into the nitty gritties of like, cool, what are our assets? What are our vulnerabilities? Who is our team? How do we figure all these pieces out? What is our action plan, short term, middle, long term? Disaster recovery is going to be a component of that. And what I'm going to be doing, and what I've done in the past when I've run courses like this, is especially when we're working with organizations or businesses, is to ask the question like, hey, what do you actually think your organization is really good at and have capacity for? And what would you be able to give back to your community in the disaster, after the disaster, in that recovery phase, in the disaster recovery phase? And as an organization, to actually be able to think a little bit ahead and say, hey, we suspect that, this is a threat in our area, and this is a threat in an area, and this is a threat in an area. And we have this one piece that we're really good at that would actually be valuable in the aftermath of any one of those. Cool. How do we maybe actually make that like a bigger focus within our organization and something that we hold, and we even think about it and plan for it in context to those disasters happening? And then we network with the other organizations around us or the other community people, say, hey, we can hold this piece. What piece are you holding? And we start to build those mutual aid networks ahead of time with some conscious forethought into, what are our gifts? What are our vision? What could we contribute? And, inevitably somebody in the community, hopefully their job is to be the map maker and to weave those pieces together, and in the course, you're going to be basically becoming a map maker, the folks that choose to join us, because we're going to have you starting to do some of this community mapping, whether you're doing it for your own family or your business, your NGO or whatever. But I would also hope that, in the course, we're going to dive into the nitty gritty specifics. You're going to have the support community to help you brainstorm, tweak it. And at the same time, a lot of this stuff isn't rocket science. It is somewhat intuitive. If you just start going down the rabbit hole and having conversations and chatting with people, you'd be amazed how much you can start to figure out too.
So we have one question in the question from Bear. We got a few minutes left here before we're going to wrap up. And it was, do you have any tips on facilitating community discussions around climate preparedness and resilience?
After the last couple, I'll let you go, Chris, first.
Sure. I mean, I guess the first one I would say is I always come back to this permaculture principle of observe first. You know, so knowing who your community is in the first place, for me at least, is going to change how I'm going to facilitate that experience. And as I've actually traveled around and worked with a few different communities doing this stuff, I'm going to facilitate it differently in different communities based on where the people are at. And if you don't know, you know, I would honestly say, because, you know, beyond the tactical approach, having the relationships in the first place and the trust and just that handshake and the camaraderie is probably one of the base foundational layers in the first place, and maybe more important than some of the specifics. And if you don't have that, you potentially have a lot of conflict coming down the pipe. So if you have a community that you're already like, they already believe in climate change, you know, they already have concern, then you can really just dive right in. And there's all kinds of activities. You know, one of those would be like the community asset mapping bingo game that you come and do, and start mapping out those resources, and then start saying, hey, you know, like, let's set up a little mutual aid network amongst our different neighbors. You know, who wants to bring which parts, you know, and so you can just start doing the mapping and dive in. But I know a lot of you are like, my community is going to be so turned off or have zero interest in that, right? I think that's where a lot of people find themselves. That's where I would say you need to maybe be a little more thoughtful in the way that you approach it. And so I would start off, honestly, like, you know, maybe the first gathering is actually like, hey, we're just going to have a community barbecue and we're going to invite a bunch of folks over, and we're not going to talk about preparedness at all. I'm literally just going to figure out, what are they interested in? It's like, oh, he's really interested in football. Like, I don't care about football, but sweet, I'm going to go talk football with my neighbor and pretend I'm interested, you know, and I'm going to get to know him and say, tell me about football. Like, I don't know much about it. Let's learn. And I'm actually just going to build a real relationship with that person. And from their relationship, I like to start thinking about, okay, well, what is the in, you know? Because if I approach it from my what interests me, it might actually turn them off. But there might be another angle. And actually, this is just a neat wrap to take us right back to the beginning of the conversation. Delyla, you were sharing about how, you know, when you started talking about permaculture, certain people weren't interested. But when you talked about preparedness, they were. That's exactly what I'm talking about right now. So if you build a relationship with your neighbors, you get to know them, that's probably one of the most important starts right there, because now we have a layer of trust. You're going to band together. You're going to figure stuff out under stress. But then the next layer of that is, as I get to know their interests, I might figure out what is the bridge. So maybe we're approaching the same thing, but from a different lens and a different angle. What is the bridge to kind of pull them in so we can achieve the same outcome? And I tend to find that much more effective when I'm working with people that have a very different worldview than me. It's like, how do we get us to the same place? Because at the end of the day, like, all people want their family to be safe, you know, or 99.9% of people want their family to be safe, you know, want their community to be safe, regardless of whether they swing right, left, somewhere in the middle, you know? So it's like, what do we do to actually start with that? And what is the pathway to get us there? And sometimes it takes just building some relationships and being a little bit tactful about it.
So yeah, you mentioned the thing that I was going to start with, which is food. Food is a great way to bring people together, even with the different people's diets. You can do a salad bar or a taco bar and make it so that, you know, your meat eaters are happy and your vegans are happy by doing something like that. And developing those real relationships and meet people where they're at. So often, you know, one of the joys of the skills tour that we did when we traveled around in the school bus and taught people whatever is that we made a list of the things we knew and said, what does your community want to learn? We met people where they're at. People don't make huge changes in their life unless they're forced to. People change at the margin. So you meet them and you talk to them and you say, oh, okay. And you talk to them about a little bit about football and say, well, I don't know much about football. What do you do for a living? Oh, you're a welder. Well, you know, tell me a little bit about that. Oh, well, you know, I've been working on this project. And then you meet them where they're at and then bring them a little bit closer to where you are. And that's where you find the middle ground. I used to do, at first gatherings, there was generally I was in Montana. There was generally, and this is true in California as well, somebody's role who was there to deal with the people who came to scream at you. And your job is when you were having a rally and people came to scream at your rally, is to get them to pay attention to you and scream at you. And then the fun part of that trick was, so they'd yell at you and you'd kind of big with them. And then, you know, for me, I always went to the same thing as, the government sucks. And then you got your right one and it's like, yeah, the government sucks. The Forest Service sucks. And you find common ground. And then off of that common ground, the whole energy can come down in the conversation and you can have something to talk about. So you meet people where they're at, you find common ground, and you build from there, understanding that they're not going to change overnight. They're not going to make a big shift and pack up their bags and go live in the woods and become permaculturalists, but they'll make changes at the margins a little bit at a time. And if people change, I've seen this, I've been around enough and done this enough that I have seen people. I mean, I worked with somebody when I was 40, and I met him because he was an injured logger who was in college and failing a biology class. And I'm like, I'm really good in the biology class. I'll be your partner. He's like, I'm really bad. It's like, I'm really good. It doesn't matter. And he changed it to margins slowly and surely. And over the 3 or 4 years I knew him, he went from being a right-wing logger to being on the community co-op board and selling vitamins for a living. But he did that one little incremental step at a time. He didn't do it overnight. So meet your neighbors, meet them where they're at, provide food, gather food, and just start making the changes at the margins. If they're not convinced that climate change is real, then say, we don't need to talk about climate change. Let's talk about what's going to happen when the forest fire comes through or the flood comes. You don't have to talk about what causes that. And then later, a year later, 2 years later down, they might, you might see some shifts in climate change in their attitudes towards that. But it's meeting them where they're at and then just slowly letting them come a little bit further and a little bit further. And that's how we enact change. It's how we enact change on the landscape as permaculture. We don't go in there and bulldoze it all down and try and rebuild it, little bit at a time. And that's how we enact change in our communities.
That was beautiful. I want to add one more piece that I think will be really nice to closing that. It's a short one. And that's it. If I'm expecting to pull my neighbor a little bit along, I need to be open to me changing and shifting a little bit too. And that neighbor actually surprising me too, right? And that's a very important one that we sometimes miss. It's like, oh, how do I get my neighbor to my thought? Well, if you want to get them to your thought, you also need to be open to the idea that like, oh, maybe I'm going to be surprised or learn something, or my perspective is going to shift too. And that's community building, right? So just a little, don't forget that piece too. It's important.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you for those who came and joined us tonight. Thank you for those who are watching. Thank you to Chris and Delyla for coming and talking to us and sharing your wisdom. I encourage you all to go and attend their classes. They all have wonderful things they're offering, and you can find that on the Earth Activist Training webpage, earthactivetraining.org. Yeah, and if you're interested in any of our classes, please come join us. I want to give a big shout out to the Earth Activist Training team that you don't see here. They're behind the scenes that make this happen. So all the people who are in the back end of our registration and administration and making it all work. So big thank you to them. Big thank you to our speakers here, and thank you to all for coming. Hope to see you in class.